Today, I'm honored to have Armen Najarian with me. Armen is the CMO and Chief Identity Officer at Agari. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. Great to be here.
Thank you. So I was really impressed with the mission of Agari. You guys say you protect digital communications to ensure humanity prevails over evil.
This is true. This is what we do.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about what Agari does. You guys have been around for a decade.
Yeah, we just celebrated our 10-year anniversary, and we are a mission-driven business. So first of all, so those words that you spoke, which we really formulated about a year ago, truly drive the values of the business. And when it comes to recruiting or how we explain to the market kind of why we do what we do, it all starts there.
Okay.
But we've been at this for a while, so we are in the space of email security.
Okay.
And you might wonder, well, email, it's been around for a long time. Well, yes, it has. But email is fundamentally not based in security, right? When email was launched 40 years ago, security was the last thing that had been thought about. It was really all about, hey, can I get a message from Stanford to get down to UCLA and make it work? And little did the architects at the time think about, well, this could be exploited for fraudulent purposes. So we are in the business of stopping bad things from happening through the email channel.
Got it. Okay, and so I read a recent article, and so we're talking about your email getting hacked, right, by an unknown predator or cyber attacker. And we all know of sort of this common thing that happened a few years ago where the Prince of Nigeria would send you an email and ask for money, and some people fell for it and gave money, and a lot of people didn't. But that was sort of the first, I guess, notion of your email being attacked and compromised through some cyber attacker. And today, it's gotten more sophisticated in terms of the cyber attacks. And I read, again, an article recently that $26 billion was lost to fraudulent email, again, from a group in Nigeria that basically it was around fraudulent invoices, I believe.
Yep.
So tell us a little bit about what is happening in this landscape of cybersecurity as it pertains to email, and as email is now moving to the cloud. How are you guys addressing this?
So let's start with this psychology and the threat actors. So it is true that the Nigerian prince that we all snickered about 15 years ago has grown up and gone to college and bought some really sophisticated tools and has band together with their friends and colleagues to form real businesses. So largely West African-based fraud rings, not entirely, but largely West African, Nigerian-based. Multi-threaded, multidisciplinary fraud rings that are in, many lines of business. And so these are acting like businesses with, P&L statements and organizational structures and hierarchies, largely exploiting email as a channel. And so, yes, 15 years ago, it was all about, these incredulous stories about, hey, you're eligible to win some sum of money, or help me move some sum of money around the world, to very sophisticated, incredible, or more sophisticated, incredible sounding schemes that effectively, you had pointed out, what's called CEO fraud. Hey, I'm the CEO that you know and trust, traveling on the road. I need, $10,000 wired to this vendor right now because they're screaming at me. Can, directed to the actual CFO. Can you please help us out? Can you please solve this immediately? The psychology behind that is, people inherently want to believe. People inherently want to do what's right and do what's good. And so these schemes really exploit, trusted relationships and, people's willingness to want to do good.
Which is so unfortunate. Because as a CFO on the other side, you're going to believe that that's your CEO asking you to send whatever amount of money is to that vendor, right? Because that's what the ask is. How is this happening? How are they getting in? How is this sophisticated, use of technology now being able to impersonate a CEO, a CFO, whoever that is? What's happening?
So there's a few ways these schemes are pulled off. At a most basic level, there's something called, effectively, you're spoofing a domain name impersonation. So let's just say there's a slightly modified version of the underlying URL from the sender that emulates, your own company, right? If it's the CEO impersonation to the CFO, or if it's a vendor, for example, a slightly modified version of that URL, but with a display name that you recognize, right? So, yes, how can this happen? Well, this happens every day, right? To sophisticated business people that see a name and a message come in from a name they recognize and don't bother to actually double click and see, is the underlying message sent from a sending domain that looks authentic?
that's been authenticated.
That's right.
Verified.
That's right. So as incredulous as that sounds, that's right.
Verified.
That's right. So as incredulous as that sounds, it happens every day. And the stat you brought up, this is per the FBI. And just in the last 3 years alone, this flavor called business email compromise, BEC, that you might have heard of,
Right.
it's at $26 billion in reported fraud loss. And I say reported because these are kind of crimes that are these are scams that are embarrassing for the company that's a victim to even report. And so the belief is that it's significantly higher than the reported fraud loss. These are schemes that get you onto the front of the Wall Street Journal for the wrong reasons, where jobs are at stake, right, from senior-most people. So yes, it is a big problem. It's getting bigger, and it's exploiting, just very basic ways of impersonating through display names or even a look-alike domain.
Is it getting easier for these criminals to do these attacks as we move into the cloud? Is there any compromise that's happening there in terms of security vulnerability or this impersonation that we're seeing, or does that not matter?
I would say the architecture matters a little bit less.
Okay.
I think the one shift though that's taking place is historically when messaging was on-prem and you had a secure email gateway and that's how you managed it. There was a certain set of controls built in there that really looked to detect, is there a piece of malware attached to a message, or the contents of the message itself just don't seem logical. With the shift to cloud and the rapid migration to cloud and in many cases hybrid environments, it's just made it more sophisticated for the enterprise to have all the tools they need available to stop these types of attacks based on identity impersonation. These are hard attacks to stop because the historical controls aren't set up to do that.
Got it. And so let's talk about Agari, and what is Agari specifically doing to defend these threats?
So there's a couple things. So there is a standard in this industry. It has a funny sounding acronym called DMARC.
DMARC, right.
And DMARC is effectively the industry standard that was launched about 10 years ago by our CEO. Our CEO was one of the core architects and authors of this standard, but that effectively defines the protocol for how email communications are in fact verified to be from a verified sending domain.
And DMARC, by the way, stands for Domain Message Authentication Resource and Conformance.
You're hired. Yes, that's impressive that you remember that.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So tell us more about that.
Yes. So so DMARC effectively guides the protocol for sending domains to introduce a certain set of controls and trust mechanisms, so that when the message can only be sent if it passes through a series of hurdles or challenges. Therefore, so receiving parties can know that they are in fact receiving proper messages.
Got it.
At a high level, that's what DMARC does. It assumes that the enterprise takes certain steps to manage their DMARC policy. It assumes that the email service providers, like Google and Yahoo Mail and Microsoft, also have taken certain actions. They are parties in this authentication mechanism.
Got it.
And those are really the two primary parties. Then the end user receiver is a recipient of the more trusted messaging.
So the email will go through this DMARC authentication layer.
Yes.
And if it is identified as a threat or a fraud, what happens?
So there's a few layers or levels of conformance or compliance, if you will, to reach the ultimate state. The ultimate state of the DMARC protocol is what's called P = reject, and that effectively says unless the series of challenges has been passed, or only when those series of challenges have been passed, only messages that pass those tests will appear in the inbox of the end user. If one or more of the challenges has not been passed, that message will never be received by the receiver. So it's the most secure form of invoking the DMARC protocol. That's called reject. There's something called quarantine, which says there's certain steps that have been taken, but the enterprise is not yet ready to lock down and exclude messages that haven't passed a certain test out of fear of, hey, maybe there's some false positives that we want to get. Those messages will go into a kind of a holding tank or a spam folder. And then there's just the most basic kind of a record is detected, P = none, that at least says, hey, the company has acknowledged that email authentication is a journey they need to begin. They might have selected a vendor or decided to do it themselves. But those are the three levels of authentication that we see.
And the ones that fall into reject, then what happens to those domains that fall into the reject bucket?
Good question. So ultimately, those domains will be subject to a takedown that the enterprise, and partnering with Agari or other vendors that do this, can help to stop, basically put out of business. Now, sometimes those sending domains are actually friendly domains, right? It might be the marketing department. So people like me, right. Innocently setting up a new instance of Marketo and maybe a special off domain to that aligns with our business strategy or the business strategy and sending messages on behalf of the company.
Right.
So sometimes it's just the sheer act of going through this DMARC journey uncovers a lot of sending behavior, innocent sending behavior, that just has not been controlled, has not been brought up to standards that the company would need, so they can avoid confusing consumers or potentially being compromised by fraudsters.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, as an end user, as a consumer, I think most of us, the emails that are sort of the bad actors end up in your spam folder. You never see them anyway. Actually, before we got on to our interview, I was actually going through my spam folder in Gmail, and I just saw a bunch of junk email that got filtered into spam. But the level of sophistication we're talking about is much greater than just Google identifying, Gmail identifying of an email domain that has not been authenticated and putting it into a spam folder.
That's right. Again, it involves the actual sender, let's just say it's a large bank or a financial services institution taking action and committing to a journey. We view the DMARC email authentication process as a journey that takes, many years. If you have, several hundreds or thousands of domains, you might have a lot of defensive domains. So it starts with that commitment. It, of course, involves the email service provider. And then there's been some innovations in recent years, some really interesting ones. One is called BIMI, which effectively introduces a trust verification mark to that authenticated message. So imagine
like a watermark.
Well, imagine a logo. So imagine you're a consumer of a large bank, and in your inbox you actually see the logo of the financial institution. Not in the subject line, but in a space next to the subject line, in the Yahoo inbox, for example. That's an added trust of verification that is very visual, of course, to the consumer. That gives that consumer the added confidence that this message that they've received from financial institution A is in fact authentic. So marketers, CMOs love that, right? It provides a lot of great enhancements to the open rate, conversion, even some branding value. So innovations like that are very recent, but are very exciting as well to help ultimately increase the trustability or deliverability, and kind of engagement with email communications.
How many enterprises today, from your view, are using DMARC?
So it's it's still relatively nascent. We're starting to see great adoption, but if you look at the universe of registered domains in the world, it's less than half have embraced DMARC as a standard, or at least begun the journey. If you isolate it to the Fortune 5,000 or 1,000, it's a relatively small portion, which is great for vendors like Agari, right? There's plenty of headroom to work with. What we have found is those that have begun the journey and have embraced it are starting to see value. They've kind of either gotten to full reject or close enough that they're seeing great value, and good news starts to travel, organically to peers in the industry.
Definitely. I'm curious, why do you think these malicious attacks are coming from West Africa, from Nigeria? I mean, I know that's not the only place, but it started, as you mentioned, 15 years ago from the Prince of Nigeria. The recent article that I read was also 167 people, I believe. Most of them were in Nigeria. What's happening there? Why is that sort of a hotbed for this criminal type of activity?
If you look at just the origin of threat groups, there are pockets around the world, so certainly West Africa, Nigeria does specialize in these identity deception-based attacks. Eastern Europe, has historically specialized in, malware types of attacks and, ransomware, and, certainly some areas in Russia have their specialties. But what about West Africa and Nigeria? To an extent, from what we've seen, just in the psychology that we've seen, is among the groups of fraudsters, there's a certain reverence for those that can pull off these schemes and do them well. They're almost within their circles. They're revered. They are revered, and so there's part of that. The other view is, if done successfully, these can be quite profitable schemes, and there is a degree of innovation. And I'll talk about a new flavor of business email compromise that is even more profitable than historical BEC, which, as you mentioned,
Business email
has driven $26 billion in fraud loss. So there's a degree of innovation because there's a generational investment that's gone on in West Africa.
Right.
We're starting to see the next generation of attack types.
And so how do you stay ahead of the curve? What is Agari doing in terms of the technology and innovation to make sure that you're staying ahead of that curve?
So ultimately, it revolves around an investment in science and knowing your customers. And so before we talk about the science, we have invested in a threat intelligence team. We call it the Agari Cyber Intelligence Division, ACID. Kind of has a cool acronym. Another acronym in this whole story.
Right.
But the ACID team, which reports into me, is headed by a 10-year FBI veteran who did this for a living.
At Interpol.
Well, with the FBI.
Okay, with the FBI. Okay.
So he was an employee of the FBI. He did it for 10 years. He helped effectively set up their cyber intelligence counter intel division, and really got into the psychology of the threat actors, understood techniques, and really saw through to prosecution. So that's part of the DNA. But back to the main part of the question is, how do you do this? Is ultimately an investment in good science that says, okay, to do this at scale, right? We serve enterprise customers, some of the biggest brands in the world. And with this innovation that's taking place, is how do you do this at scale without, I'd say more simplistic, deterministic, hey, I know this either URL is bad or good. How do you use a probabilistic technique involving science? And that's where a lot of the machine learning comes in that we've invested in, in recent years to really start to identify patterns. What looks like, what trusted behavior have we recognized between a sender and receiver? How could we extrapolate that out to trusted sender-receiver behavior and all the attributes associated with that? So that in the moment when we see a message come in that veers from that model of trusted good, we can instantly ascertain that that's probably not a good, healthy message coming in and treat it accordingly.
Interesting. Got it. And recently, not only are you the CMO, but now you're also the Chief Identity Officer at Agari.
I am.
So talk to us about what does that entail? What does that mean?
So I've effectively taken on the strategy, if you will, for how we think about identity and the many levers associated with that. Ultimately, as we talked about just a minute ago, these are crimes of identity impersonation and identity deception. Right. There's no attachment necessarily to look at. There's no malware.
Which was the traditional way you would think about it. Don't open that attachment, or there's some malware associated. Now it's just invisible.
It's invisible. It's based on words and influence, right? And there's not even necessarily a link. So there's not a URL necessarily associated with that. And so my view from a business perspective is to solve these problems at scale and to constantly get better at it. It revolves around a strategy based on identity. And so based on my experience, kind of some of the experiences that I've had prior to being at Agari, this is all familiar territory, and there are some investments we're making at the company that I've helped to kind of rally the troops around to say, okay, if we're going to do this at scale, we need to have a data science platform. We should be set up in a certain way with the right people in the right places. There are certain influences in the industry we need to reach to support that. So that's been kind of the Chief Identity Officer part of my role, in addition to my CMO responsibilities.
And you mentioned, very few of the Fortune 500 are actually using this sort of DMARC authentication layer of trust and verification. As your job as a CMO, how are you educating these enterprises to understand that this is a real problem, a real threat, and again, for them to get ahead of what might be an imminent attack at one point in the future?
So I see the education is through channels that you are probably very familiar to much of your audience. We ultimately are selling to the head of information security, the InfoSec leader. The one nuance about that audience is they don't like to be sold to, right? They ultimately like to buy based on reference from their peers. And that's one very distinct nuance that we've heard time and time again. And so how do you influence that peer group? Well, it's based on trust, right? And so there are some very specific industry groups, right, where the CISOs cluster together. So that's one way, is we invest in some industry organizations and become relevant and bring a lot of thought leadership, a lot of research-based insights to bring something new to the table. That's been very helpful as well. We have also encouraged our customers to on a one-on-one basis, kind of share their good success with others, right?
Mm-hmm.
Part of that's done through influencer marketing, advocacy marketing,
Right.
and that's been very helpful as well.
Yeah, those third-party testimonials of customers that have had success with your product, those are the types of validation that you probably can go a long way in terms of influencing the other CISOs out there to make that decision purchase.
That's right. That's right. The other unique aspect of what we do is it's all in the public domain. So you can go to agari.com and you can look up any URL on the planet and see whether that URL has embraced the DMARC standard or not, and where they are in the journey, and even who they're working with as a vendor. So as far as communicating out quarterly trends reports, and slicing that by industry or by geography, that's also been a very helpful way to kind of keep beating that drum with fact-based information and share that with our audience.
Okay. And you recently wrote an article on LinkedIn about, you guys have been here for 10 years, and then the next 10 years is going to be very exciting. We had talked a little bit offline about, email, and there's some, banter out there that email might not be relevant to the millennials who are not, used to opening an inbox or seeing an email because they use other forms of communication. But quite to the contrary, you guys have a different point of view on that. Tell us a little about where do you see this going in the next 10 years?
Yeah, so make no mistake, email is still the killer app, right?
Yep.
Despite the rise of social applications like Slack, which is a very successful business, even SMS-based communications and voice communications, all digital forms of communication, email is still, from an enterprise perspective, both with between businesses and from businesses to customers and consumers, still the predominant way that messaging is orchestrated.
Right.
So we felt that a degree of focus for the past 10 years has been very important to really help to solve some of those fundamental problems that have existed for the past 40 years. And that started to pay off, that degree of focus.
Right.
Now that said, as we project forward into the next 10 years, certainly other forms of digital communication, like social applications, Microsoft has a great application, there's certainly Slack and others, we're going to need to pay very close attention to and have kind of an analog answer to how we address that. Even voice communications as well, right? You can spoof through vishing and voice sampling, you can impersonate someone.
That's a good one.
That's a good one, right? That's a good one. But there's all these different variants.
Right.
So, if you were to fast forward to say, okay, our positioning today is around this, this area that we describe as the Agari Secure Email Cloud.
Right.
Project forward, at some point that becomes the Agari Secure Messaging Cloud.
Got it.
Digital messaging, digital communications.
Got it. Makes a lot of sense. Okay, and as a CMO, what does your day-to-day look like? What does your worldview look like as Chief Marketing Officer at Agari?
Yeah, so I'd say it's very outward in, and it's a dynamic space. It's always changing. There's a lot of news, very timely, newsworthy items, because the last thing a customer wants is to get popped. And that happens quite a bit. And typically, these are high stakes scenarios. If it's a data breach, right, we've seen some very prominent, not just CISOs, but CEOs losing jobs over being breached, and that breach generally originates through the email channel, right? Their credentials were phished.
Right.
Those credentials were compromised. Fraud actor was able to access certain information sharing portals, and so I pay very close attention to developments in the news. I certainly look to see what our competition's doing, and then just really understanding our customers. And so we have a lot of checkpoints with our field team to understand what's going on in the world of our customer community and kind of the health checks. Right. I play an executive sponsor role on several of our customers, so that keeps me in a very practical way engaged with what's actually happening. Right. What problems are we solving? Where might we be falling short? Yes. And so I can personally play a role in helping to address some of those issues.
Okay. And you've also had a lot of roles in your past as product marketing. And so are you involved with sort of the product roadmap or the product part of Agari, and making sure that you're getting the right messaging out from a marketing perspective on product that's being launched?
So short answer is yes. We've, over the past year, started to transform product marketing at Agari from being great sales enablement and asset creation to really kind of front-end MRD type of work, right? We don't necessarily call it an MRD, but
market requirement docs.
Yes, but as far as saying, okay, when we look broadly at the markets, for the markets that we serve or markets we wish to serve, what are some of the key capabilities that we could monetize, that could solve a big problem? And so yes, my product marketing team has started to play that role in a more visible way,
Okay.
partnering with their product management counterparts. But yes, that personally gives me access to long-term thinking about how we make investments in our product.
Got it. And talk a little bit about your world as it pertains to demand gen. Has that changed from 5 years ago to where it is now? Are you still looking at sort of the traditional funnel, MQL, SQL, close one? Are there different channels that are working better for you as it pertains to demand gen?
So yes, a lot's changed and a lot stayed the same at the same time. So the SDR, sales development team, reports into marketing, and that's been a very helpful lever
Okay.
to to drive a higher level of quality
Right.
for SQLs that are introduced to the fields. That's been very, very helpful as well. Deep focus on analytics hasn't changed necessarily. So we're a Marketo Salesforce.com shop.
Okay.
We have a pretty well-developed attribution algorithm. I think that's been very helpful. We rarely get into arguments, with our sales counterparts around attribution, but it's also important to understand where are the investments paying off.
Right.
Was it truly an inbound inquiry from a partner or a customer we've never talked to in a certain part of the world? It's good to know that, so you can start to repeat some of those behaviors that might be contributing. So I'd say that hasn't changed as far as what's changed over the past 5 years,
Right.
but it's been very helpful to affirm that. And there's still a very interesting reliance still upon physical events, right? We still do a lot of physical events. I had mentioned some of those industry groups.
Yes.
They're called the ISACs, information sharing groups. It's where the CISOs congregate by industry.
Okay.
Those play a very instrumental role still. And we augment that with other face-to-face type of smaller format activities, meetup type series,
Sure.
or something we do with one of our partners around that has the word fish in it, PHIS, steak and fish, for example. But those types of in-person activities
Not
play
the
a big
band
role.
fish, in case of you guys are wondering.
There we go.
But the kind you eat.
There we go. There we go. Just to
Right.
clarify, yes.
Just to clarify.
Yes, so I'd
Right.
say, a lot's changed, but a lot stayed the same at
Right.
the same time.
So that one-to-one sort of meet and greet really still has an impact because you can educate them, inform them in a group setting and over a dinner or whatever it is at events.
Especially if you're able to get an existing successful customer to come and share.
Right.
That's ultimately where the value is delivered, and customers want to hear from customers, of course.
Yeah, got it. So, we talked about these cyber attacks and criminals getting more sophisticated with the tools that they have and the ways that they can penetrate these inboxes through impersonations. Are you actually engaging with? How do you stay ahead of them? How do you engage with them? How do you is there something you're deploying to get ahead of them?
We do. So, back to an investment in threat intelligence. Again,
Yes.
this ACID team we talked about
team,
earlier today.
right.
Not only do they study the market and produce great thought leadership, but they also play a more tactical role, and they're actually fighting fire with fire. They're actually engaging, active engagement.
Okay.
Taking it even a step further, they're actually, in some cases, compromising the fraudsters' own email accounts
Right.
and getting access into those accounts.
Got it.
From that, as you can imagine, extracting a whole treasure trove of information
Right.
to learn more about patterns and investment areas on behalf of the fraudsters,
Yeah.
but also to work more closely with law enforcement.
Interesting. And so this is really important, again, going back to the CISOs and understanding the importance of investing in this type of technology to stay ahead of the curve, to be able to see what's around the corner. So to
That's
speak.
right. So by definition, these are criminal operations, and they're investing in their own innovation. And there's always a new flavor of the year or the quarter. There just so happens to be one right now, and it's getting a lot of attention. It's called vendor email compromise. So instead of BEC, this is VEC.
Yep.
VEC is the hot new thing.
This is like supply chain.
It's your supply chain. So it's exploiting. So imagine you're a big manufacturer of a vehicle or an airline, of aircraft, and you've got a supply chain of hundreds, maybe thousands of suppliers. That's where the point of vulnerability is, right? Because generally these suppliers aren't as big. They don't invest in the controls. They can be compromised.
Right.
Once they are compromised by the fraudsters, they can then begin to engage with the customer in a very authentic way, in a very believable way.
Wow.
And so imagine when it comes down to accounts payable, right, where the customer is paying the vendor, a diversion of that invoice is really where the vulnerability is, and we're seeing that quite a bit. So we're now seeing kind of two-part, frauds that are very, very
VEC,
difficult.
And now the vendor as well.
That's right.
Very interesting. Well, it sounds like you have your hands full, but you're also part of a very dynamic company that's taking this head on, and that's very, very good to know and good to hear.
It keeps it exciting, and it is invigorating to stay on the cutting edge.
Yeah, awesome. Let me switch gears very quickly and just fire off some other questions. Armen, what is your superpower?
My superpower, I think of myself as a conductor.
Okay.
I'm actually conducting music, and so I
Nice.
use that analogy. I've got a really strong team
Okay.
in the marketing organization and threat intelligence team, and
Mm-hmm.
getting all those pieces to work together in harmony,
Mm-hmm.
and to kind of play itself is how I view my job in a large way.
And how do you conduct? How do you do that?
So I hire great people.
Okay.
Number one, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to conduct an orchestra without having great people in place. So that's table stakes.
Yes.
But then it's really just establishing clear communication among all the instruments
Mhm.
and myself,
Mhm.
and then establishing trust
Mhm.
as the bottom line equation.
Got it.
And from there, the music can play, quite well and quite naturally.
Right. Got it. Got it. Do you have any daily habits or rituals that keeps you productive and in the flow?
Yes, so this is the truth. So every day, I'm a night owl,
Okay.
and so every night at around probably 12:10 a.m.,
Uh-huh.
the Marketo report for the previous day comes in.
Okay.
So I study that. I mean, I kind of wait till it comes in, and then I study like who's engaged with our content, and are they repeat visitors,
Okay.
and what patterns are they taking. I learn a lot from that.
Okay.
Back to one of your earlier questions of how do I kind of engage
Yes.
with the market. That actually very tactical report that comes in every day is one of the goofy rituals I engage with, and it's been very helpful.
From 12:10 to what time do you do this practice?
I try to keep it efficient, so within 30 minutes.
Okay.
Yes.
Got it. Got it. So at 12:10, you're waiting for the Marketo report to come in, which you analyze in, let's say, 30 minutes. So that leads me to my next question. Do you believe in work-life balance? Or is that possible?
I do. So I have young kids. I have 4 young children,
Okay.
and a wife that works as well. So absolutely, there has to be. I kind of subscribe to the blended, work-life balance.
Right. Right.
Where it's never really black or white. That said,
Yeah.
of course, I unplug,
Right.
on weekends and
Mhm.
vacations, and that's very, very important. And I encourage my teams to do the same.
Mhm.
And but I love what I do ultimately, and it's an honor to be a CMO and Chief Identity Officer at a company like Agari.
Right. What's on your playlist?
What's on my playlist? I've been listening to a lot of Hamilton lately. So my wife and I saw a whole series of performances this past summer so that we could see Hamilton.
Okay.
And now I've since seen it 3 times,
Uh-huh.
and
It's incredible.
it's
If
a
you
great
haven't seen it,
performance. But I
yes.
love the soundtrack,
Yeah.
and so I've been listening to a lot of Hamilton replays. It's 2 hours and 10 minutes of great content
Awesome.
that when I'm working out helps pass the time quite well.
Fantastic. Armen, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. That's all the questions I have. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we sign off?
Well, thank you, Rajiv. Really enjoyed being on your episode here. And what I'd like to leave your audience with is email as a vehicle is highly vulnerable.
Right.
And despite recent tools out there, identity, deception, and impersonation is still a big, big threat. There's a lot at stake here. So I encourage you, if you're a marketer, encourage your InfoSec team to take this seriously.
Yeah.
And build the proper defenses to protect not only your enterprise, but your customers.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
See you next time. Bye.